Legislative Preview. I'm Rachel LaCourte, AP's correspondent here in Olympia. Today we're going to have two panels, Senate and House leadership, who are going to talk to us a bit about what we can expect over the next couple of months. Then at 10 a.m. we'll be joined by lawmakers who will discuss the ongoing pandemic and its effects on everything from health departments to schools and businesses. First, I'd like to introduce our first panel. I have House Speaker Laurie Jinkins, House Minority Leader J.T. Wilcox, Senate Majority Leader Billig, and Senate Minority Leader John Braun. Thank you all for joining me. Well, I wanted to start with the news of the week, which was the change to the protocols for House and Senate operations. I know initially you all had wanted to have more lawmakers on the floor in person during the session, but some changes were made due to rising COVID counts. So I wanted to talk with each of you about some of the challenges that you feel like you'll be facing as we enter a second legislative session in this sort of hybrid mode, and as well as this being the third session in which the pandemic is the backdrop to everything that you're doing. So I'm going to start with the speaker, and then if each of you could follow in the order you were introduced.
Thank you, Rachel. It's good to be here with my colleagues and with reporters. I wish that we were doing I never thought I would say this, but I wish we were doing an in-person AP forum. And I look forward to doing that. I would say the last month or so has been some of the most frustrating and disappointing time I've had, and I've had a few of those in the last few years, but I was really looking forward to, I think as was everyone in the House, being back to a more normalized session. Omicron has just made it so that we could not do that. So yeah, I think, for us, we have always kind of had a three-legged stool that helped us in our decision-making around how we would conduct session. One leg of the stool is related to the safety of our staff and the public and members. Another leg is related to being transparent in the work that we do. And the third leg for us is being able to do the work of the people. One of the good things about last year is that we've proven that we can achieve all three of those things, even in a fully remote session. So that's where we're going to start. And we are going to check in every 2 weeks with the hope that we can slowly start bringing more people back onto the floor. House members will be able to come, whether vaccinated or not, to their office spaces and work in their office. And I expect a number of members will do that. We'll have rigorous testing going on. But I am, I've said a lot, and I continue to say this, I don't think I can ever let hope overcome reality. Nonetheless, my hope remains that we will be able to go, that the reality will come to pass, that we'll be able to come back even this session with more people on the floor.
And then Representative Wilcox.
Thanks, Rachel. And first, I want to say I think that the Speaker is feeling the responsibility of all the people that work in the House. It's not just the members, it's the staff as well. And I've been responsible for large groups of people in my life as well, and their safety. And understand how that feels. I also have experienced times when we failed at that and how devastating that can feel too. So I don't discount the sense of responsibility, and I know that Speaker Jinkins feels that. I have another point of view as well, and that is that we're surrounded by people in this state who have had to work hard every day, farm workers, for example, people in healthcare, teachers now, police, other people involved in law enforcement, the folks that deliver the products that allow a lot of people to work safely from their homes. And I think that safety is an important thing, but I think we, as well as demonstrating safe practices, we also have to be willing to show that this is not the new permanent normal. And I would much rather see us have more human contact. Politics and government is a human business. It's not purely mechanical. And I'm very happy to see that the Speaker and I believe the Senate Majority Leader are talking about examining these practices every 2 weeks. I think we see clear across the economy, especially in the healthcare world, reevaluation of how important it is to be in person and what state practices look like. And House Republicans actually presented a proposal to the Speaker about a month ago that included testing, which was rejected then, and now I think in a positive way is part of the process.
Senator Billig.
Thank you.
There are other risks, both in K-12 and to the public if they're not permitted to see their legislature, do their job in person in an accessible way. So I really believe that we could do this. And while I respect the fact that we ought to be careful with the surge, I think we could do this in person with testing. I was in Olympia yesterday, checked out the testing system, got tested, negative, by the way, just in case you're wondering. So it works, and it works really efficiently, and our staff has done a great job of setting that up. I don't think we're fully utilizing it to keep folks in Olympia talking together, working together on problems. And I would just take, while I certainly appreciate the work of the majority, I take a little bit of a different opinion on, did we get our work done last year? Did we get the checklist for the majority done? Well, yeah, certainly. But what we're finding out is several of those bills, think about the sort of, police reform or anti-police bills, as some call them, that passed last year without, I think, sufficient input from the public. And the challenges our law enforcement folks and are seeing around the state and the public safety issues involved. Did we get the checklist done? Yes. Did we do it in the right way? They got the right result for the people of the state of Washington? I don't think so. And I think having these restrictions is going to make it harder again this year. I am hopeful, though, and I do very much appreciate the willingness of the majority to reevaluate periodically, and their commitment to getting us back in person when they feel like conditions allow. I just think that this zero risk on public health, the zero risk mentality has impact. It's not that we shouldn't do our best to be safe. It's that there's other impacts from that effort. We should recognize those as we make decisions.
Okay, and I'm hearing that we had some audio glitches that started when Senator Billig spoke. So I apologize, Senator Billig, but I think I'm going to have you just briefly kind of give your response to that again, so that you're not the only one who's like muted during this broadcast. Okay. And I think we got most of Senator Braun's. So I think if again, Senator Billig, if you could just shortly summarize your comments before we move on to my colleagues.
Yes, I'll be brief. And yes, I appreciate we've had really constructive conversations. The key to me is that we're getting the people's work done. We demonstrated last year that we could do that. We did do it effectively. We had record participation. We had full transparency, and we were safe. And we're not, trying for zero risk. That would be great if we could have get our work done effectively and have zero risk. That's not the case. We are going to have people on the floor. We are asking our staff to come in, but we're trying to get the right balance where we get the people's work done, we do it effectively, we get together to do that work, but also make sure that we're not taking unnecessary risks that we don't have to take to get the people's work done. And look, we all want to get back to normal in the legislature, throughout the state, throughout the world. And hopefully these latest changes are fairly temporary. That's our goal, is to be back on the floor, before we hit the floor for those heavy days. This should only impact a few weeks, which means a few days on the floor if things go well.
Okay, and before I move on to questions from my colleagues in the Zoom, I just wanted to remind everyone to stay muted until I call on you. I'm going to start with Olympia Press Corps members who have already indicated that they want to ask questions. If you haven't talked to me already and want to ask a question, please flag me in the chat. And if you're having technical difficulties, put your question in the chat and I'll read it for you. Also, this is a reminder that we are recording and all of you have recording permissions as well. So I'm going to start with Joseph O'Sullivan from the Seattle Times. Go ahead, Joe.
Good morning, everyone. Question for each of the caucus leaders. State tax collections have rebounded pretty dramatically since the early days of the pandemic in spring of 2020. The legislature last year passed a $59 billion two-year operating budget with $5 billion in new spending and then appropriated $10 billion in federal COVID relief. On top of that, and you're coming back to the legislature this year with, again, more tax collections than anticipated. I think the governor in his supplemental budget added a few $1 billion of spending, and there's also some federal COVID aid left, which gives you more money, I think, than usual in a supplemental budget year. So I'm curious to hear from each of the caucus leaders what you think the priorities should be on that spending in terms of priorities, program increases, or spending reductions and tax cuts.
Rachel, how do you want us to sequence?
Well, I was going to let any of you want to jump in, but let's start with you, Representative, since you jumped in first.
Okay. Well, you're right. There are immense cash flows coming to the state, which was a surprise to me. I, like a lot of us, thought that we were going to be looking at a recession, and instead, thanks to immense numbers of dollars that are causing a different kind of a problem, dumped into the economy by the Fed and by the federal government, we have tremendous cash flows right now. And I think, first of all, this is a moment when we've had immense tax increases. We should mitigate those. In fact, I think that we should repeal some of those. At the same time, we have demands on our transportation system, and I think almost no other route to solving those than to use some of these major cash flows that are coming through the general funds budget, and we should spend those on our transportation infrastructure. If you care about the rural economy, if you care about the urban economy, understand that we all depend on goods and services that are able to move around the state and around the country. And the gas tax, first of all, is as regressive as it can get in terms of its impact on working families. And second of all, it came in for 3 last session. There were 2 immense bills that over the long term are going to have tremendous inflationary impacts on the cost of fuel, and we can't depend on a gas tax anymore. So let's use those dollars to increase road capacity. And I'm a Republican, but I would also say let's use them for the smartest impacts when it comes to public transportation as well.
Would either the speaker or Senate Majority Leader like to respond to that?
Sure, I'd be glad to go. Yeah, I mean, I think this is it's a really positive sign. Certainly, there's a lot of reason to be happy with the economic progress and results, and I think that is something that we're seeing across the country, but particularly Washington is leading the way with a robust economy. And part of the reason we're leading the way is because we've made smart investments in across the board, but particularly in our COVID recovery, and really proud of the work that we've done in a bipartisan way in COVID recovery. Look, these have been tough decisions, but I look back to even remembering right when the pandemic started and there were calls for special session and we should cut. And we said, no, this is not the time to cut government. This is the time when people need government to be able to support them. And we came up with, really over the last 2 years, programs that have helped to support the people of this state. And the results that we're seeing are really positive. But let's make no mistake, there are still a lot of people in need. And so what should we do now that we have some additional funds to invest? Even though we've made progress, we still need to make more progress in affordable housing, in childcare, in mental health. We need to keep making progress on education. So there are a lot of areas where people need help. And I think that's what you're going to see throughout this session, is that we try to invest in a continued robust recovery, but making sure that it works for everyone.
Does anyone else want to weigh in, or otherwise I'm going to jump to the next question because we have a lot of people lined up here in a short amount of time.
Rachel, I'd just like to reinforce one thing, if I may.
Sure.
Sure. So I want to put this in perspective. $60 billion budget, essentially. It's 59 something, but round to 60. That's a gigantic budget, very robust, not a perfect budget. There's no perfect budget, but robust in virtually any way you look at it. Right now, the people of Washington State aren't saying, hey, we need more help. They're saying, get out of our way and stop taking the funds we have. They're faced with inflationary pressures, and they are very concerned with pocketbook issues, in their immediate lives. So tax relief is a big deal. Property tax in particular is a big deal. The transportation thing, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to reform our transportation system that could change lives of millions of Washingtonians for decades. Look, we have 3 decades of addiction to the gas tax and to bonding that gas tax. Regressive, there's got no future. We can take, without affecting any services in the operating budget, and make a long-term structural change to the way we fund transportation, make big infrastructure investments around the state, rural, urban, and change our future in the state of Washington. This is the year to do it. $10 billion more than we need in this year. Now, some of that's one time, but there's some one-time expenses there in transportation, like culverts, like fish barriers. But a lot of it is ongoing, and it's a unique time. I don't think we have the time to go into details. Unique time, tremendous opportunity for the legislature to step up and change the future of transportation in the state of Washington. And if we miss it now, we may not get another chance. Thank you.
Rachel, I'll just add in quickly. I think a lot of great comments on this. A lot of the money that we have this year still remains one-time only money. I think the conversation about transportation, that's a possibility there for transportation. But for for the House Democratic Caucus, we have had strengthening economic well-being as one of our pillars of what we're going to work on this next session. So just to give you some examples, around that, I think we may consider some expansion or improvements to the working families tax credit that we passed in a bipartisan way last year. Also, Rep. Sullivan has a bill to start a state loan program for our young people who are trying to go to higher ed, move from high school into their next space of contributing to Washington. But these would be at a much lower interest rate than the federal loans or private loans they could get. On that topic, Chair Slatter is also working on kind of expanding the college grant to make sure right now that money can go for your tuition, but what people need is help with their housing costs and food and things like that. So there are a number of other kind of areas that we think that we'll be looking at. What's important for us is that as we are into this economic recovery, we typically have an economic recovery that is very disproportionate, and everyone in Washington has to recover, and we're going to be focused on making sure that everyone recovers.
Okay, next question is from Jerry Cornfield from the Everett Herald.
Thank you very much. Actually, two questions. One just for Speaker Jinkins and one for everyone. Will be a little bit lighter at this stage. But Speaker Jinkins, I wonder if you could tell us why the House Democrats are looking to delay the long-term care payroll tax until the middle of 2023. And are you and your members concerned that you need this session and next session to get it right? Or is there concern that doing it on January 1st next year would make it a potentially difficult election issue in this fall? So that's my question for Speaker Jinkins.
Thanks, Jerry. I'll just jump right. I won't give the whole rap about how great the CARES Act is and how important it is to aging Washingtonians in particular. But let me just answer your question quickly. I think that we do have two bills out there that are intended to be improvements to the CARES Act, and those will be passed, I think, fairly early this session, hopefully. But we're also looking at a couple things we've got to study, and then we need next session to implement them. One of them has to do with the fact that the private long-term care insurance industry has asked us to look at the opt-outs and what kind of provisions we might include for people who opt out and then drop out of their private program. And so that's going to take a lot more research and maybe some work next session. And then we also need to look at whether or not there's a possibility of making the benefit more portable to people who retire and then move out of state. That also will take a fair amount of time. So the reason that the delay is in the Sullivan bill is scheduled to last for 18 months is so that we can get through two sessions and do the work that's necessary in these two sessions.
Jerry, before you jump on to your next question, I just wanted to follow up on that. Looking at history, the paid family leave law was an unfunded program that sat on the books for years before the legislature figured out a way to pay for that. How concerned are you that it might be multiple years before there is a consensus on how to pay for this program?
I'm not. I think that the way that the program is being paid for is appropriate, and it's exactly like the family. Well, not exactly, because there's no employer pay-in, but it's a payroll premium on the workforce. And so that people are saving for their own needs. And we know that 70% of people are going to need long-term care. So I think this is it's a good program. No big transformational program like this is without the need for improvement. And that's what we're focused on doing over these next 2 sessions. And I'm feeling good about where we will end up, and that we will end up in a place where people will no longer have to spend themselves into poverty in order to get long-term care. And that's the goal of this program.
Jerry, go ahead.
This question might be best for Senator Billig to start, but all 4 members be interested in. Looks like the bill of the session will probably be making pickleball the official state sport. Senator Billig, is this a bill your caucus? It's coming out of your caucus. Will you move it out of the Senate, and is the House ready to embrace pickleball as the official state sport?
So yeah, you're asking a baseball guy who also represents the one of the best from my district, one of the best college basketball teams in the country. Very hard to get excited about pickleball as a state sport. I will say that I'm a big fan of pickles, and if somebody wants to put a bill forward to make pickles the official something of the state, I think I could get behind that.
I just want to add in, I took up pickleball during the interim. Love the sport. It's great. It's as somebody who's, well, we're all aging, but it's been a great sport to take up. And the people, the 85 and 90-year-olds that I play with are it's kind of irritating that they can beat me in pickleball, but I'm still new. Anyway, I have no idea how the bill will move or if it will move, but I do love pickleball. I love every sport that Andy mentioned and a bunch more.
Okay. Anyone else? If not, I'm going to move on to Austin Jenkins from Public Radio.
I wanted to ask you about plans to quote unquote fix some of the police reform bills that passed last year. So the question for the Democrats is what do you, maybe less about the specifics and more about what you're trying to accomplish here? And for the Republicans, is this a matter of fixing some flaws in these bills, or do you want to see a wholesale repeal and a completely different approach to public safety? We can start with the speaker.
All right. So I think in terms of what we're trying to get to this year is an appropriate balance. And I think we thought we had that last year. We got feedback from law enforcement in particular over the interim that they thought they needed more clarity on a number of these issues and some shifts. So I think we're really trying to, like I said, achieve balance here, Austin. I'm very happy to have seen data come out this year that says we are at a 5-year low for fatal police encounters. So I think that we moved in the right direction on these issues, but I think you will see some bills to both tweak and clarify for the most part. And, for example, even though, the Attorney General issued a letter saying, yes, you can use force if necessary in behavioral health, welfare checks and child welfare checks, law enforcement remained, I don't know if I would say unwilling or unsure about that. So we'll clarify that. And I think this is, again, as I said, it's all about achieving the right balance. And anytime you take some of these big, more transformational acts, you definitely need to stay open and then be willing to continue to have trailer bills and tweaks to find the exact, the Goldilocks spot on these. And I think that's what we're trying to achieve.
Hey, Austin, I would say that most of us agreed directionally that we needed to improve the relationship between police and the people that they most commonly interact with. Anybody with eyes saw that there was tragedy resulting sometimes in bad cops, other times in lack of understanding of proper tactics. But I also think last year was the very worst year that we could have done this, because the public input and the input from the police was too easy to ignore. It's true that they probably set records for the number of people that testified, but a lot of those people testified in 30-second blocks. That's quantity of public input. It's not quality of public input. I talked to many police and law enforcement officers and organizations that didn't testify because they were afraid of retaliation. That's not a way to have a proper process, and it's not the way to have a good result. It's true. One of the organizations supported the bills. All the other police organizations that I'm aware of did not support the bills. It is really good that the people that supported these bills in the first place, the members of the House and Senate, are acknowledging that there are improvements, in some cases major improvements that need to be made. But there was a price to pay for people and families. Tragedy ensued in part because these bills went too far. And I think that the lack of process, the lack of face-to-face contact, and especially the fact that we were in an atmosphere where people didn't feel like they could fully share their experience, meant that we had tragically flawed bills. And I'm glad that there's going to be fixes. By the way, I think every single one of the fixes that are going to be implemented could have been implemented last year via amendments that were offered and rejected.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there. So the question was, do we fix them or do we throw them out? I don't think there's a single right answer. The question is, are we going to really listen this time and fix the problems? And so far, I haven't seen bills out there from majorities that actually get after all the problems: the pursuit issue, the probable cause versus reasonable suspicion issue, allowing our mental health professionals to work collaboratively with law enforcement in ways that keep them safe and their clients safe. So the question I have is, are we serious about listening this time and fixing real problems? Because it's one thing to talk about transformational bills, but another thing when that transformation leads to deaths in our communities around the state. That's just wrong. A stepwise approach that ensures proper training and proper accountability for our law enforcement officials without causing additional community safety and tragic outcomes is the right way. And I hope we back up, fix the problems we know about, and take a little slower approach to make sure we keep people safe around the state. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the basics. These bills are about rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the public, and they're working. The stat that the speaker mentioned, but also just like the response that we get in our office, which has been overwhelmingly in favor of these bills. And remember, there was, I think a dozen police-related bills. Most of them have been implemented without any problem, and most in a positive way. There definitely are some follow-ups, as there often are on big policies. But one of the things that the heated rhetoric on these bills obscures is some of the other really good work we've done in recent years on public safety. And there's a bipartisan bill that came out of the Senate 2 years ago that worked on supervision of property crimes offenders to lessen their time in jail, but to increase their time getting supervised in the community to better reintegrate them into the community. And we're seeing some very positive results on that. Something that was actually originally an idea of Senator Patton, and I ended up prime sponsoring the bill. But that was a real bipartisan approach. There's a bunch of examples like that, and more we can do in our goal of increasing public safety and building trust.
Okay, we're going to move to Keith Eldridge from Como TV.
Hi, thanks for taking the question. The significance of this day nationally and both here at home at the Capitol steps just outside, even though y'all weren't there, obviously there are people who are saying the election was fraud and they breached the governor's mansion fencing. What are your thoughts on the statement that needs to be made today in reaction to what happened a year ago?
Let's start with Senator Braun.
Look, what happened a year ago, the events both in Washington State and nationally were wrong. And I've said they're wrong from the day they happened. Political violence, regardless of the motivation, is wrong. It's wrong when we saw it in the summer of 2020 in Seattle. It's wrong when we saw it in Olympia. It's wrong when we saw it in D.C. It's not stopped being wrong.
Representative Wilcox.
Thanks, Rachel. I had a pretty important to me interview with Matt Driscoll on that day, and I would invite any of you that wonder what I thought then to go take a look at that. And I wouldn't take a single word back. Matt Driscoll from the News Tribune is who I mean. I'm going to give you a little bit of a long answer here. Speaker Jinkins and I were on the phone earlier that morning, and I don't watch much national news. She mentioned what was happening, and I quickly checked my Twitter feed, and she said that she was going to go into Olympia that day, and I just felt like it was important that both she and I be there. It wasn't a partisan thing. It wasn't because I thought she needed protection. I just thought we should both be standing up in our offices and saying that we're going to continue government as it should be in the state of Washington. I also said I thought threatening people was un-American. You know, we've had protests, we've had riots, but I think that we were on the knife's edge of even greater disaster that day. And if a recognized leader would have been available, that person, you know, might have been killed. And, you know, no life is more important than the other, but the symbolism of something like that in terms of our structure of government would be devastating. And the other thing that I said about that day was that this will destroy us all unless we're willing to use whatever influence that we have, say that's not the way we do things here. I was able to watch what was happening at the Capitol out my window. I applaud. There was a fairly young state patrol woman on the porch of the governor's mansion, and she didn't leave. She stayed there and asked people to behave peaceably. And they, for the most part, did. They didn't, I don't think that they threatened her. They certainly didn't go into the governor's mansion. But I also know that there was at least one member of the press in the back of the group that was mistreated. And we can't have that either. We all depend on a free press here. And we depend on a diversity of opinions. And we have to stand up for that as well.
Speaker Jinkins.
You know, Keith, I just have to start off by thanking Senator Braun and Representative Wilcox for being strong and consistent in their language around the insurrection and what happened at the Washington State Capitol. Not everyone in their party has done that, and they've both faced a fair amount of criticism for it. And I just want to say thank you and how much I appreciate them doing that. I was down in Olympia on the day that the governor's mansion property was breached. I had gone down because we were having a practice session to practice for our first fully remote session, and was watching it from there, and had my office window open and was listening to the rally that eventually became the breach. And you know, it was these incidents were fueled. They were absolutely fueled by misinformation and real attempts to overturn one of the things that I hold most dear, which is our democracy, our way of government, our system of laws, our voting system in Washington State and across the nation. And, you know, we're recognized in Washington as having one of the strongest sets of voter protections and the best run electoral systems in the nation. And that goes for everything from our Voting Rights Act to same-day voting to youth voter pre-registration to our vote-by-mail system, which is the model for the nation. And I guess I just want to be clear that what happened a year ago was indefensible. That I think the four corners in this legislature has stood against it very strongly, and that those in my caucus will continue to do that, and we will continue to focus on access to democracy and voting through this session and through every session to come, because we think that voting is the thing that actually protects our democracy.
Senator Billig.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, those attacks were an attack on our country, an attack on our democracy, and they were based on a lie about election fraud. And that would be bad enough, except that there are still today a significant number of people and some elected officials that are continuing to perpetuate that lie. And again, I also laud Senator Braun and Representative Wilcox. I really do appreciate them. And I know they did take some heat. But there's too many people and even elected members of our legislature that are continuing to perpetuate the lies on which this insurrection and attack on our democracy were based. And so we need to continue to speak out about the truth, about the 2020 election and going forward. And, I really do appreciate in our state the work that Secretary of State Wyman did and all of the auditors across the state to make sure that we had secure elections. I know Secretary of State Hobbs is going to continue that tradition and the work that our legislature has done. And it's been a really big focus of our majority since we came in 5 years ago, came back as the majority to focus on election security, on voting access, and to make sure that every vote counts and is counted fairly and securely, and that we can trust our election process. And so I think I really appreciate the question because we need to keep talking about it so we don't forget and so we can counter the lies that are out there.
Okay, next question comes from Melissa Santos with Crosscut.
Hi there. I'd like to go back to the police-related bills for a minute. There were a few bills, particularly from the House, that didn't get through last year that I know some lawmakers still would like to pursue. That includes ending qualified immunity and also establishing independent prosecutions for police uses of force incidents or police killings, I think specifically. I guess I wanted to ask the speaker, are these things that are too heavy a lift to get done in this short session, or do you think that these kind of bills are things that can be pursued even now beyond just the fixing of some of the bills? I also would like Republicans to, I'd like to follow up with Republicans in a minute too, but speakers, are these things that can be tackled this year?
Yeah, I mean, Melissa, I guess what I would say is our priorities are going to be to addressing and achieving that balance in legislation that was passed last year. That's going to be our highest priority with our police accountability legislation. I expect those other bills that you mentioned will get hearings, and I think we're going to have to see what kind of both energy there is around them, as well as the engagement over the interim. I mean, one of the things that folks don't see is all of the meetings that members have with interested parties over the interim. And like last year on our police accountability bills, Representative Goodman and Johnson were having multiple weekly meetings with the law enforcement community and other parties as we work through those. So we'll just have to see if they're ready or not. I don't think there's opposition to them necessarily moving, but I don't think they're agreed upon bills. And on the prosecutions bill, it may be more agreed upon, but it's a constitutional conundrum to figure out how it can be drafted to make sure it is constitutional. And this is one of the downsides everybody gets with having somebody who's trained as a lawyer being the speaker. I kind of demand constitutionality on legislation that we pass, or at least that I believe it. So anyway, that I think you'll see hearings. Don't know if we'll move them or not.
For the Republicans on this issue, are there other police-related bills or measures you would like to pursue beyond a few of the tweaks that the Democrats have been talking about already making? What are your top priorities when it comes to amending sort of our police accountability statutes as we have them now, or other police measures?
Yeah, I think it's exactly what I said earlier. We're going to be focused on, and there's lots of different ways to do this, whether it's new bills or new ideas or reforming the current ideas on fixing the problems we're seeing in our communities around the state today. How do police, how do we make it so they can reasonably pursue a suspect in a way that's legal, that is fair, and can keep people safe? How do we make sure they can work together with the mental health providers around the state to make sure we keep those providers and their clients safe? So we're going to continue to be focused on how do we make our communities safer. I don't know that we need additional bills this year to do that. In fact, I would say if there's one thing beyond fixing the bills that were passed last year, I guess there's two things. One, if we're going to pass new things, how about we do it on a bipartisan basis? And Senator Billig mentioned earlier some bills that were passed previously on a bipartisan basis and have worked out fine. What we're seeing is the bills that were pushed through on a simply a partisan basis have had trouble. So if we're going to do anything, how about we do it together? That seems like a good idea to me. And the other thing is we have enormous workforce problem in law enforcement, in part because of some of these bills in the state of Washington right now. We are already the lowest per capita across the country in terms of the number of law enforcement officials per population in our state. And it's gotten much worse for a number of reasons. These bills, some pandemic-related issues. But how about we help our local law enforcement rebuild some of that in a way that brings good training, good accountability, and good community safety around the state?
John, you're absolutely right about this. And Representative Maycumber from the House Republicans has concentrated for several years on how can, if we want to have a really good public safety and law enforcement community, you have to recruit great people and you have to recruit a diverse workforce. Her bills have concentrated on that. The fact that we've allowed law enforcement to be demonized to the extent makes it even harder to have the most effective people want to have that career.
Okay, next up is Laurel Demkovic from the Spokesman Review.
Thanks, Rachel. This is kind of a follow-up to Joe's question a while back about the budget. There is a lot of money that you guys are going to have to work with. What kind of discussions are you imagining will happen around a tax cut, for example, or some sort of one-time stimulus check or something to get that money directly to people? I know that the governor has said he didn't want to see a tax cut, but is that something that you guys kind of support? Thank you.
Yeah, I can start with that one. I think, we showed last year that was a priority to return money and cut taxes for the people who are hurting the most with the working families tax credit. That had been a Democratic priority for several years, and we're able to pass that in a bipartisan way. I think, as the speaker said, we could look at some expansion of that, because that really goes to the people who are hurting the most and who are really hit by the most regressive of the taxes, which is the sales tax. And so I think that's one thing we can look at. I'll mention that Senator Randall has a bill that would eliminate the tolls on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. I think that's a great idea and one that we should pursue. I think you'll see some others there, but let's not forget that the people are still hurting. We still have needs in affordable housing and mental health and childcare. And so we need to keep making sure that we're making investments that help to move everybody forward. I said it earlier a little bit differently, but I want to say it again. What this pandemic has shown us is that when government makes strategic investments to support its citizens, that's good for the economy. That is good for our state and good for the people of our state. And so, yes, we should be looking at some strategic places where we can make our tax code less regressive and be able to return some money, but we got to make sure that we're also making the smart investments to help people succeed.
Yeah, and I would go back to a few other things as well. First of all, I don't think there's anything more regressive on working families than the cost of fuel. And things that happened last year, immense increases in the cost of carbon, which of course turned into the cost of fuel and the cost of commuting for people that want to live where they can afford to live and have to work because of the way the economy develops long distances away. So let's make a huge change by figuring out how we can fund transportation in the future, not by doing it with a road tax of some kind. Let's use those dollars to build a transportation system of the future and not depend on hard-pressed working families and commuters to do that. And one other thing, we've got this tax we've already mentioned hanging over our head. That is the long-term healthcare tax that has been delayed for some time. And, sometimes there is an important problem and there are great ideas. And when you run the numbers, they just don't work. We know that 25% of the payroll in the state of Washington is already opted out. Every fix that is being contemplated doesn't add any revenue to that system. It adds additional cost and vests people more quickly. I don't think that it's going to be sustainable financially. why don't we get rid of it and replace it with something that is a partnership with the private sector? Representative Stokesbury is working on a bill that would repeal it and then replace it with something that actually works. I think that would be a pretty good approach to providing tax relief as well.
Okay, I don't see anyone else in the chat wanting to ask a question, so I'm going to go back to Joe Sullivan, who had a follow-up question. Joe, are you still there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, question for the caucus leaders on housing affordability. The legislature's done some on that in recent years, and yet rents continue to go up. I think last year Spokane had one of the highest rent increases in the nation. Housing prices have risen all over the state, from Okanagan County to Clark County to here in Thurston, and of course, it costs $850,000 on average, I think, to buy a house in King County. What can the legislature do to bring this affordability crisis to an end, like sometime in the next 10 years even?
Well, I'll jump on that. There's a ton we can do, and maybe more importantly, there's a ton we can stop doing. I mean, I challenge you to go back and look at every bill that comes out of the Senate Housing Committee. Nearly every one adds cost to buying a home. Sometimes not a lot of cost, but it all just keeps piling up. So the combination of 30 years of growth management, which I'm not saying growth management is necessarily a bad thing, but we refuse to reform it in ways that allow for building of homes of all sizes, of all shapes. And we're going to have to just acknowledge we have failed here. We're 250,000 homes short of what we need in the state of Washington to house our population. We have to find a way to make that both affordable to build them and affordable to buy them. And they're connected, of course. And we start by stopping to add cost. I mean, simple things like in all the attention last year on the capital gains income tax, kind of, it never got noticed that we doubled the recording fee to buy a house. Now, it's not a lot of money, but it's just one more example of adding a little more cost to the purchase of a home. And of course, that all adds up for rents as well. The other thing I would say, and something I'd like to see us do, kind of going back to the last question, with this very fortunate position we find ourselves with the operating budget, now's the time to go back and rethink what we've done to property taxes in the last few years. There's an effort made by the majority a couple years ago to increase the local levies. I think this is a chance where we could use that money to provide that funding as it properly should be from the state, and reduce local levies, reduce the cost of owning housing, and get people in homes or ability to rent at an affordable level. But there's a ton of stuff. But I would go back to what I said to begin with. One of the things the first thing we should start doing is stop adding more cost. Let people catch up. Let people have a chance. I have enormous faith in the ingenuity and the ability of the citizens of the state of Washington. If we just stay out of their way, I'd say we ought to stay out of their way for a while.
Yeah, and Rachel, if I may, this is housing affordability, and housing generally is a focus. One of the things that happens with housing investments and policy is that it takes a while, because it takes a while to build houses. It takes a while to see the results from investments that have been made. The good news is Democrats have delivered on investments in housing, and particularly affordable housing, over the last couple of years. So as those investments come online, it will have a direct and positive impact on the housing situation. And what we need to do is to keep making those investments in the Housing Trust Fund and the other housing programs that we have, because we know it takes probably 2 to 2.5 years from when those investments are made until we start seeing the results for people on the ground. So those are going to continue to come online because of this really significant investments that we've made in recent years. And I just want to go back and address one other thing, because Representative Wilcox a few times has mentioned the climate bills. Climate change is one of the defining issues of our generation. And I think we are going to be judged back on our time as leaders here on what did we do to help on climate action? What did we do to help preserve the quality of life that we have, and to make sure that climate change doesn't continue to get worse and impact all of us and our constituents in really negative ways. And so I'm really proud of the work that we've done on climate action. That will continue to be a focus, and it's something that I think is vitally important for us in Washington State and throughout the world.
Okay, we have time, I think, for one. Oh, go ahead, Speaker.
Rachel, I'd just like to add a little bit in on the housing issue. I think one of the biggest challenges we face is that there's a shortage of housing at every, except for the most wealthy people, you can get a house. Everybody else, there's a shortage. And as a result of that, one of the things that happens is that folks who can afford to buy a higher end home can't find them. So they end up perhaps buying a home that is more, for a first time home buyer or affordable housing category. And it just really stresses and puts pressure downward on folks. And so we've got to do things that address every issue, from homelessness up through affordable, low income and affordable housing. We've got to get more volume going in that. I do think, like Rep. Hackney, I think, has a great bill that I'm hoping will move forward this year that provides a REIT exemption for private developers who want to sell to an affordable housing developer. That is another, these are a series of small policies and large fiscal investments that we've made that will work and that do have an impact. But many of the situations that we're talking about right now, it's taken us a long time to get where we're at, and it's going to take us a while to move forward. We just got to keep on being super persistent and moving forward. And I'm not going to go, if there's a question on climate change, I can talk at length. I'll just say ditto to what Senator Billig said on the climate change issues.
I think we're just about at time. I know Melissa Santos had a follow-up. I will go to her very quickly if you guys could wrap it up in 2 minutes.
I wanted to ask just really quickly, the governor has a bunch of proposals out that kind of deal with climate change, really upgrading building codes to make it more efficient, building on what we've done before. Also this, allowing duplexes and more dense housing is one of his proposals, and your transit zones, also duplexes throughout cities. I was wondering what you guys each think about the single family zoning sort of changes that the governor's proposing and whether those upgrades to building codes make sense. Maybe we could just go down the line really quick, like Representative Wilcox.
Rachel, I'd like to answer if I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. It has taken many, many years to get into this. And part of the problem is we've demonized some kinds of housing. We've said you can't build here, but you have to build there. We've had bills almost every year that make it almost impossible to own a manufactured housing development. I'm all in favor of making zoning much more simple, but you can't just do that in the densest places. Somebody earlier mentioned that housing costs were at a record high in Okanagan County. Well, that's because it's almost impossible or it's very difficult and very time consuming, very expensive to build in places where, there's not any kind of overcrowding at all. And so I think the first step that we have to take is pause these building code changes. Those add an immense amount to the cost of housing, and it also reduces the options that people have to keep themselves warm and cook their food and all those things. And we have to decide we're not going to limit this only to transportation corridors. There's a ton of rural employers, for example, now that are struggling because they don't have a workforce that can find housing next to them. So we could actually take people off the streets if we would allow housing around rural areas where they have a workforce challenge as well. We have demonized so many different segments of housing. That has to end. And that's what's got us into the place that we are right now. I've heard last night there's a 250,000 unit shortage of housing in the state of Washington. For $1 billion, you can build about 2,500 public housing units. That's 100 years. This is going to take the private sector, partnerships, and the public sector.
Rachel?
Yes.
I know we're out of time, so I'll be quick. And I talked about climate in my last answer, and I'll just say I want to look at the specifics of the governor's bills, but I'm generally supportive of those ideas. I did before, I thought we might get a chance earlier, and just before we leave, because this is the first public appearance I've had since Senator Erickson passed away, I just wanted to recognize him and his passing. It was, the first time since Senator Hill passed away, the sitting senator has passed away, and I think affected us all. And certainly his family, his wife and daughters have been in all of our thoughts. And, it's a time like this that really, I think, makes us all appreciate our families and our colleagues. And I just didn't want to go without recognizing him and make sure that to note that he was a significant part of our chamber and somebody that we will miss.
Anyone else want to weigh in on Melissa's question before we end this panel and move on to the second?
Yeah, so sure, I jump in there. I just reinforce what JT said. This cannot be fixed with state investment in affordable housing. I'm not saying that's bad. It's a part of the solution, but it's going to take all people, all the private sector, the public sector working on this issue to fix it. On climate change, I'll go back to what Senator Billig said earlier. We're certainly going to be judged on what we did, but that means not only what we did actually had impact, and that's the question I think we have. We're much more focused on are building codes going to change the long-term plan, or can we do things that are much more meaningful to impact the environment much more quickly than squeezing another 0.2% out of our energy code in a diminishing number of newly built homes. It's not the way to get at the real problem. And I think we will be judged because we're focused on the wrong stuff to solve the real problem.
Madam Speaker, one word, do you like the governor's single family zoning plan idea?
I think it's definitely worth conversation. Here in Tacoma, where I live, the city has just spent 2 years going through work on this and has adopted a very robust and good plan. So I think for me, the question is really about balance between, usually the conversations in local government about doing this and how you do it and how you achieve density and all those things is very, very important. On the other hand, if you don't have people doing it statewide, you have really disproportionate impacts across the state. So for me, that's the dialogue about this question, and I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, well, that ends this panel. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we will see you next week. So we are now going to move on to the second panel, and this is just a reminder for my colleagues because I am herding a lot of cats right now. If you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat. That's the only way I'm going to see it right now. So the second panel is going to be a broad discussion about how COVID is still with us and all the impacts that it still has across the state. So I'd like to introduce Republican Senator Judy Warnick. We had a little bit of a last minute mix up, so she's in for Senator Short today. We have Democratic Senator Manka Dhingra, Republican Representative Jacquelin Maycumber, and Democratic Representative Mia Gregerson. Thank you all for being here again today. So I did talk with the leadership panel this morning a bit about how this is our second session where we're in sort of this remote hybrid situation, and it's the third session for you all where the pandemic continues to be in the background as you do your work. So what do you see as the biggest COVID-related issue that you want to see addressed as a legislature as you do your work over these next 60 days? And I'll start with Senator Dhingra.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Yes, this is going to be our second session that we will be in a remote hybrid setting. And I think the most important thing about COVID is making sure we're protecting the health and safety of people and communities in our state. I have to say I've been very impressed with the way our state is frankly leading the nation when it comes to having the least number of hospitalizations, the manner in which we're handling COVID response. And so I think a lot of it is ensuring that we are keeping the public safe, ensuring that we are also making sure our families are being taken care of, that people are getting the help that they need, and that there is a plan. And I'll just say that even financially as a state, we again have done a stellar job in dealing with the pandemic from a financial sense as well. So I think continuing what we have been doing for the last year and a half.
Representative Maycumber.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being on today. Right now, I was on the bill as a Republican, the emergency response to COVID. And I do echo the good senator's statements regarding the health crisis. This has been a health and economic crisis for our state of Washington. It's been very stressful for all our members and constituencies. We know that we had that initial response where we wanted to make sure the governor had the ability to respond quickly. I also requested that the governor not have 50 million or 100 million. I thought maybe it should be almost $1 billion, which it's turned into. It's been a huge crisis, both healthcare and economically. But unfortunately, we need to come together as a legislature and look at the emergency powers reform. We need to make sure we continue to legislate while allowing the governor to respond on that ebb and flow when we have high spikes like you're seeing this week. And so making sure that we as legislators continue to be able to be heard in our local areas and reflect that and how COVID is reflecting in our local areas. Unfortunately, it's been difficult to share that as a legislator in the last 2 years and really make sure that those local responses are occurring in the Eastern Washington area. So I would like to see a conversation where we return some of the powers back to the legislature.
Representative Gregerson.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to be here on this panel also. And I would like to echo so many of the comments you've already heard today, but I also want to add to that while we really focused on recovery in our budget and our policy last year, this year we're going to make sure that we are restoring and improving our relationships. We know that a lot of folks back in our communities rolled up their sleeves and really had innovative approaches to make sure that we dealt with COVID and the pandemic more locally. And I think that we're going to use the next 60 days to ensure that they feel supported and we're modernizing in places that we can and working together.
Senator Warnick.
Thank you, Rachel. And I want to echo a lot of the comments that have already been made, but I'd like to start out by thanking Senator Billig in the last panel for recognizing the difficulty that Senator Erickson's family is going through and our caucus is going through. So I want to just publicly thank him for his kind words. What I'm seeing and what we as Republicans in the Senate, our goal is to be safe. Our goal for our senators to be safe. Our goal is to keep our communities safe. What we're kind of disagreeing on is how we do that, and how we address some of these rising cases. But what I see us fighting more is transparency, misinformation. We are getting, and I'm sure the other representatives and senators on the call, I am getting so many emails that said, well, this is happening and this is happening. And it's really not. There's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of mistrust of government and government agencies. And so you're doing this today is helping us to be more transparent. And we need to be doing more of that as a legislature. Let our constituents know what we are doing. And you're helping us do that. So fighting the misinformation that's out there, what is true and what isn't true, I think is our biggest goal right now. So thank you.
I'm going to go to Shauna Sowersby with McClatchy.
This is kind of a follow-up to what Senator Warnick just said, but how, as legislators, do you go about fighting that information or misinformation that you were just talking about? Like, how can you do that with your constituents, maybe privately or in other ways? How do you fight that type of misinformation?
Well, I don't put, thank you for that question. I don't put out a blanket statement that this is all untrue. I work with my staff to research. Where is this information coming from? How did people get off track? And what is really happening? So we do a lot of research before we answer. And it's kind of a case-by-case basis because lately I've received a whole bunch of emails about what's going to happen next week at the Department of Health meeting. And a lot of it is speculation, but the agenda is out, but I'm looking at that to figure out what are they going to be talking about. And so a lot of it is case by case, and it involves a lot of research on our part too.
Did anyone else want to weigh in on that for Shauna?
No, I'll weigh in on this because this is something, for the last, I would say, 4 years has been a struggle nationally, where people put their opinions out as facts. The fact that people struggle with even recognizing what science is, it's a challenge nationally. And to Senator Warnick's point, I think the more we can talk about data, the more we can talk about science, the more we can really refer to credible sources, the better it is. But I'll say one of the things that has been just so heartwarming for me to see is when the Senate moved to a remote session last year, we more than doubled the number of people who weighed in on bills than ever before. And so to me, just making the legislature more accessible, more transparent was really amazing, because we weren't hearing from the same people over and over again. We were hearing from people who could never ever drive to Olympia to testify, who felt nervous and scared about walking into a hearing room. They could just testify from their phone, from the computer. So I think the more we're accessible to people, and really making sure that they have that opportunity to voice their concerns, I think the more we can build trust.
I'm going next to Hannah Scott at Cairo Radio. I don't know if Hannah is on right now.
So sorry, there I am, wrong button. Okay. I have a question for Representative Maycumber, and possibly Senator Dhingra could weigh in on this. There had been a lot of attention given to the bill that was proposed by Representatives Hackney and Simmons, the drive-by shooting bill. And I know Representative Maycumber, you had some passionate thoughts on that. And I had the opportunity to hear from the House Public Safety Chair, Roger Goodman, who tells me that bill will be dead on arrival and will not be getting a hearing. So I wanted Representative Maycumber to hear your thoughts on that, and Senator Dhingra and anyone else, if you had anything to offer.
Thank you, Hannah. I appreciate the question. That bill is shocking and concerning. We should be protecting our communities and our most vulnerable, and those are our children asleep in their beds. To lessen these crimes really just puts it in perspective when you have this huge increase in what we've seen as murders, rapes in the last 5 years, just a huge increase in violent crimes. And to have these policies, once again, look at decreasing penalties instead of looking at to try to lessen these crimes is just, it's a travesty for our children, our families, and our communities. We need to start moving towards looking at respecting just the safety of our children asleep in their beds. And everyone's heard the stories, even recently, for drive-by shootings. So to protect those children, we should not be having these policies be dropped. And that is my concern about sometimes these virtual meetings. You don't talk to people or victims. And I was listening to a press release that the recent victim of or a past victim never got a call. And we should be legislating with the people that are affected by these policies. So the sooner we can get back to talking to the communities, talking to the victims, and talking to the constituencies in which we serve, the better that the state of Washington will be.
Thank you, Hannah, for that. I did see that it had been dropped in the House, and we don't have a bill like that in the Senate. What I will say in terms of the rise in violence that we have seen nationally, this is unfortunately not something that is only limited to a certain area or a certain state. These are trends we're seeing nationally. One of the largest trends is that the homicides we're seeing is a 30% increase in domestic violence fatalities. And especially in the last few years, we have done a lot of work in helping survivors of domestic violence. But it's not just about helping the survivors, it's about really understanding what is going on with these families and individuals, and trying to be a bit more proactive about domestic violence. I was so proud of the big protection order bill that we had last session. It was unfortunate that in the Senate, it was a partisan bill, but really making sure the criminal justice system is accessible to survivors so they can get that protection orders when they need them, and modernizing that we have. This session, I am working with Senator Trudeau in really taking a look at the data around violence and death, and doing a much better job as a state. And our state actually does not have any kind of a criminal justice integrated data system. A few of the states around the country have now started doing that. And I'm looking forward to that work, because we have to start tracking where these violence is occurring, in what areas, and kind of going back and making sure we're mirroring that data with public health data so we can start doing early intervention programs. And Hannah, I can talk about this issue for hours, but the other one thing I will talk about is a couple of years ago, I had the bill that created the first Office of Firearm Violence Prevention. And I am so excited about the work that they're doing and the early intervention funding that has gone out through DCYF and that office, programs like Choose 180 and community passageways that really are making sure that we're trying to get to our youth to really understand and really divert them from getting involved in violence. So a lot more there, but I think we also have to really, other than just reacting after the fact, is really taking a look at the root causes of what's going on and have a combined public health, criminal justice response to that.
And can I do a quick follow-up, Rachel, just for Senator Dhingra on the looking at root causes and all of that? This week, there was an arraignment for a person who had been committed to Western State, found not competent to stand trial. He was an attempted rapist out of your office, actually. And the same thing that we've seen multiple times in the past is there was no room at Western State. So the charges had to be refiled by the King County prosecutor, because they caught it, and fortunately they didn't end up sending him to a less restrictive alternative, but that's ongoing and problematic and dangerous to the community. What are you doing in your work for behavioral health and involuntary treatment to try to address that?
Thank you. I actually have two bills. And I think they're both scheduled, either the first or the second bill on that. Actually, three. Sorry, Rachel, I know we're going to talk about this now. We have an assisted outpatient treatment bill, which is something that really was not being utilized in the state of Washington, because we required a whole host of things to happen before people could access this. And so we had a hearing in the Behavioral Health Subcommittee last summer, and we are actually implementing a lot of the best practices across the country. There's a companion in the House, Rep. Jamila Taylor is sponsoring that, and so I look forward to the House sending that bill over. I had a bill a few years ago on outpatient competency restoration. So not all those individuals need to go for restoration services to Western State Hospital. Many of them, some of them, can actually get those services out in the community. And so this program was rolled out statewide a couple of years ago, and they had a slow rollout. So each county's got resources over time. And so I have a trailer bill to that bill this session that actually makes sure that we are making whatever tweaks are needed to fix that outpatient competency restoration. The third bill I have is actually taking a look at those individuals who are currently at Western on a felony flip. These individuals that were on a felony and their case was then converted to a civil case, and really going backwards from there and taking a look at when did they come into contact with civil commitment. And what you will find for a lot of these individuals is that the hospitals actually refuse to place them for a wide variety of reasons. So they're not able to access services when they need them. They then get involved in the criminal justice system. They start off with misdemeanors and then they end up with felonies. We know who these individuals are. I really want DSHS, a lot of our partners, HCA, to take a look at these individuals and actually have a process for them to access the state hospitals when they're declined for services at the hospital level. So they don't have to go through the criminal justice system, but can get that level of inpatient services that they need. And a lot of these programs, the hope really is that you are going to clear up room at the state hospitals for the forensic services, and so that individuals who really need that restoration through the criminal justice system are getting it. But again, another topic that I can spend hours talking on, but I will
Another
stop so
panel,
Rachel
another
can ask.
day. We're going to move on to Melissa Santos right now.
There's about $1 billion, I think, in federal COVID relief money that I believe has not been spent right now. I'd like to hear from each of you how you'd like to see the state spend that money, in particular those federal dollars, and to, I guess, whatever's going on right now, help us get us out of us, or sort of improve the lives of people who are affected by the virus and the crisis we're in right now.
Okay, if we could start with Representative Gregerson.
Sure, thanks. Well, we're still unpacking the governor's budget, so I think he's got some great ideas there, especially when it comes to using those one-time dollars to commit towards getting more healthcare workers trained and in the field around affordable housing and ensuring that folks are sheltered and able to live and thrive where they live, where they want to live. And then, of course, anti-hunger efforts. And I think that we'll want to use one-time dollars to ensure that, of course, public health providers in our counties and our communities have the resources they need, whether it's for more testing or masks. And then our staff in our school system, ensuring that they're able to continue to work safely and get the staff that they need to be able to care for our children. And you're also seeing some energy around our child care centers. We did a great investment last year, but I think we need to continue to invest there. So those are just some of the things. I know very active members who have lots of provisos that really speak about what their local communities are asking for. And we'll be taking a very deep, careful look at all of those provisos to make sure that we're using those dollars in the best way possible.
Senator Warnick.
Thank you. And I agree with Representative Gregerson. I think training of healthcare workers, training of workers for small businesses, encourage people who have been not working on assistance of some type to retrain, whether it's through local training programs or the community colleges. But small businesses are hurting for workers. We've had to we've seen businesses cut hours, cut services. So training would be very helpful. The food system, the entire food system, there's different shortages. And so bringing more help there. And to our schools. I talk a lot to our rural school districts who are hurting for transportation dollars. So if we could ease some restrictions on how we can get money to those schools to at least get back on their feet and get back going to a normal situation without dipping into needed fund or dipping into their funds that they've already got for other purposes. But schools, small businesses, and agriculture is where I'd like to see it go.
Senator Dhingra.
Thank you. I think there's some great ideas from both people who've spoken earlier, and we're really making sure that we are helping the resiliency of people. And I have to say, behavioral health, our children, we have seen the numbers rising there, and even our schools. It's all things that could be needed. For one-time dollars, there's also a lot of work that we can done in our technology infrastructure as a state in making sure people who need services want to apply for benefits. We actually have a better portal or system for them to engage. I sit on the Governor's Poverty Reduction Task Force, and there's some great recommendations there for one-time investments and really making sure that our services are streamlined and meet people where they're at. I don't know if anyone's heard from people who apply for benefits it's not a process that is easy. And so I think there are a lot of things we can do to make people's lives easier. And I think that's what we should be using the dollars for.
Representative Maycumber. I think we can all agree that we were definitely in a health and economic crisis, and this one-time money is there to assist in that. You definitely see and agree with the healthcare industry and making sure our education, and in some places in my district, the children were out of school for a year,
and had no internet service. And I mean, we're given meals by a bus with a USB card to try to learn something. And so really catching up on that education and making sure that we have the technology to get internet to many of these places, including my travel lands. It's unfortunate that some children were out of school for years and others were continuously attending education or had the ability to attend online education. So making sure there is equity in the education service, and then also making sure small businesses are the backbone of our economy. They're the ones who pay the taxes and make sure that we have those social services for people in need. And so making sure those shutdowns do not close any more businesses who have struggled for the last 2 years, and making sure those ability to keep them open and keep them going. So that would be what I would hope to see.
Okay, next up is Laurel at the Spokesman.
Thanks, Rachel. On the topic of kind of healthcare funding, Washington and the country is experiencing a nursing and a healthcare worker shortage. I'm wondering if you can talk about kind of what the legislature can do to kind of work on that and help get more nurses, more healthcare workers in those positions. I know the governor has some ideas in his budgets. I've also heard, a state staffing standards bill, nursing compact. So kind of what are your ideas there?
Let's start with Representative Maycumber.
Thank you. In the past, we've had policies, and I believe it was Representative Shelly's policy to look at having our veterans, families who have nursing degrees actually come through the state of Washington and be able to assist and go through the process of being able to work in our healthcare industry. So having that state compact really does assist in some of those. Washington State is not one of the states that allows that. So making sure that we have the ability that we have trained nurses in the state of Washington, in the Spokane area, to be able to work in the state of Washington could immediately assist in this crisis.
Senator Warnick.
Thank you. And I want to tag on with the training of what Representative Maycumber just said. My idea, and we could use some of that federal dollars that we just talked about, is some tuition forgiveness for nursing students. My mother was a nurse. I know how hard they work. I know how long it takes to become a good nurse. But if we can help with some tuition forgiveness to get people more interested in the nursing profession, I think that's something that we should be looking at very strongly.
Representative Gregerson.
It's hard to add anything different that smart folks here have already commented on. I think, again, it's just committing our investments in partnership with our colleges and universities to ensure that we're have a robust workforce development and training all across the state to ensure that folks where they want to live are able to get that extra training and get into the fields that they want to work.
Senator Dhingra, do you have anything to add before we move on?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just add very quickly that this is again an issue that is not only for the state of Washington. There's a shortage of workforce issue across the country, and unfortunately not just in nursing, across the healthcare field. So I think anything we can do to incentivize our youth getting involved in these fields is great for a long term, but the short term, I mean, we simply don't have the bodies that we need, and anything we can do around credentialing, having using other individuals in helping with some of the workload is going to be something we need.
All right, next question is from Austin Jenkins.
Let's stick with the workforce issue, but broaden it. And also, let's talk about the immediate moment we're in with this Omicron wave. The governor has said he wants to keep schools open, that's a top priority. He's going to deploy more tests and more masks. The response that I saw on Twitter yesterday and that I'm seeing in my own school district is that school staffs are already being decimated. There aren't enough substitute teachers. My kids' buses were canceled yesterday afternoon, and today the Olympia School District has a bunch of limited route situations. What, if anything, can the state do to assist in the moment in this crisis to get people behind the wheels of school buses, into classrooms, to make it easier to become a substitute teacher in a pinch, to get boots on the ground where the crisis is happening in the moment, at the moment, not 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 5 years down the road.
Start with Senator Warnick.
That is a very good question, Austin. What can we do right now? And it's not just school buses. I was a school bus driver in the past, and I'd love to be able to help out, but time isn't going to let me do that right now. And then we're also looking at sports. I know some of the challenges for sports have been finding enough referees to keep the games going, because that is so important to keep that going for these students. I listened to a number of students in the Davenport School District a couple weeks ago who are just, they want a normalized system. They want to be able to go to school, but they also want to be able to compete in sports. And so if we can keep that going safely, what gives me hope is that this Omicron variant should be short-lived. We had an F&O meeting with the Senate just recently this week. And we're going to review our Senate policies in 2 weeks, because we know Omicron is more of a short-lived virus or part of this COVID. So Africa is already hit its peak. It's on its way down, from what I understand. So if we can just help our students and our workforce, our school workforce especially, make it through the next month, we should be able to weather this.
Representative Maycumber.
Thank you, Austin. I have 3 kids in public schools, so I definitely feel your concerns too. You know, as this emergency has gone through, you know, the last 20 months, 24 months, we've really seen this crisis, this emergency button. And I've said this before in interviews. I have concerns when people become apathetic. When it's a constant emergency, we've shut things down, and then we see these high, you know, ebb and flow. We're not responding back and forth. And the governor did, and I will commend him to keep the schools open. You saw, as the good Senator Dhingra mentioned, the mental health crisis in our students that did not go to school, and a lot of students that were unable to, while others did. So you do see that emergency response, but we held it so long. I do fear that people become apathetic to the state of emergency. And now we have children in crisis, and we want to make sure they continue to get fed, they continue to go to school, their education stays strong. But I share in your concerns, and that's just another reason that we have to respond accordingly to a state of emergencies, not over long periods of times, but hear people and actually have the conversation from the legislature when we are in these crises, so we can immediately respond with an ebb and flow during a health crisis.
Representative Gregerson.
Yeah, I mean, Austin, these are the conversations I think we're having all day, every day for the last couple of years around both what is the problem, how do we solve it, how do we do that short term, and then how do we prepare ourselves to recover out of the pandemic. The pandemic has lasted much longer, I think, than any of us thought. And what I think we all agree on is that the level of uncertainty is so great that investing in human capital is going to require sort of a new way to really connect with people where they are, to identify really their burdens or their hurdles of either going back to work or how to retrain them to go back to a job that they feel is worth their time and the risk. With that, I think that's where our trusted messengers, our trusted partners more locally are going to be important. Our community technical colleges, our labor allies, or our labor friends, to make sure that what people are saying and what's causing them to quit, and then to figure out what will make them want to come back. At the same time, the needs are so great that we need to use these one-time dollars to help keep people where they are and stop the downward spiral of schools closing or staff shortages. So hopefully we'll all be in this together with a short 60-day session to figure out some great solutions. I think there are some great opportunities here, and I think we should really focus on that continue. Washington is really doing well compared to other states, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that.
And I'll just quickly add, Austin, that, I do have kids in public school, and just yesterday I got that close contact email. Luckily, my daughter was not one, but we're getting those multiple times a week. And they're two components, right? You have the reality of COVID, and then you have the fear. And there are a lot of people who are fearful of getting it, and not necessarily because they're putting themselves at risk. They're putting their family members at risk. They're putting the children who don't have access to a vaccine at risk. They're putting those individuals who are immunocompromised at risk. So it's very hard to legislate things when there is that fear factor, and people are going to make choices, hopefully, that keep them and their families healthy. But in terms of that, making sure that as a state, we're providing resources to upgrade ventilation systems so we have good ventilation, making sure that masking, testing, good practices about hand washing, like all of those that we're emphasizing over and over again. And I think as elected leaders, we have to be talking about vaccines and masking and hand washing and social distancing, and really making sure our physical infrastructure really does have the ventilation it needs to keep people safe. And I just want to say thank you to all our school administrators, teachers, for what they do every single day. I know it is not easy, and the last 2 years, especially for our education and healthcare industries, has been just devastating. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who works in both those industries.
Next up is Joe Sullivan.
Hi, Washington State has received, I believe, north of 12 or $13 billion in federal COVID aid since spring of 2020. That money, most of it's been distributed by the governor, the legislature, to schools, to public health departments, both state and local, rental assistance, grants to businesses, other things. But certainly in the rental assistance, it's gone slowly in some cases. I'm curious to hear from the lawmakers what you're doing to evaluate how the money's being spent, to make sure it's being spent wisely and getting where it needs to go. And what are the metrics that you're using to judge whether this money's being spent well?
Start with Representative Gregerson.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I think the answer that comes to my mind is the similar lens to what we actually used when we spent the money last year for the 2 different budgets that we passed. And that is trying to figure out we know that the recovery is uneven. So who's being affected the most, and how do we get those dollars to them fast without barriers? And so going back into this next session, we're going to ask those same questions. Did those communities get the money that we allocated? Were they spent wisely? Was it helpful? Was it useful? Was it enough? And then, of course, being nimble about changes that have happened in the meantime. Where are there new areas or efforts that we need to fund or to be in partnership to ensure that, whether it's small businesses in rural communities, whether it's areas with a low frequency of nonprofits that can help do some of the groundwork. I think those are the questions that we're going to be asking ourselves. Of course, racial equity, communities of color are hurt the most, and ensuring that if they speak other languages, that we're putting things in appropriate languages, so that, again, we talked about factual information earlier today. And in order to be a responsible body, we want to make sure people have the facts and can make decisions for themselves.
Senator Dhingra.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, because actually our extremely dedicated Ways and Means chair had the same question just a few months ago. And so we actually were emailed a document that does a federal state source breakdown for our 2021 legislative spending, specifically on housing, and really breaks down what the total is, what the state did, what the federal did, so we can track where those dollars are going and exactly what population that they're impacting. So so it's not just you asking the question, I think we really do want to make sure that the dollars that we're putting into different resources have the impact that we expect them to have. So for housing, we do have that breakdown. We're going to continue watching it. For education, is the same thing. You know, it's really interesting because there's a federal formula on how we distribute education dollars, and it's based on the Title I formula from the feds. And what an interesting thing that happened with that formula is actually the schools in my district, Lake Washington, North Shore, Bellevue, instead of getting about the average of $2,000 per pupil, they end up with under $500 per pupil. And so you have to take a look at that discrepancy and how we can accommodate for that. So I think it is very imperative that we dig deep into these numbers and really do make sure that we are getting those questions answered. So the data is out there. Hopefully this next session, in a lot of the ways and means meetings and sessions, you will be getting more details on that. But it is something that the legislature is tracking.
Senator Warnick.
Thank you for that question. And I will tag on to what Senator Dhingra just said. I also sit on the Ways and Means Committee, and I'm very interested in receiving those reports. What I have done is talk to the organizations, especially in the rental areas, the landlords, private landlords especially, the barriers that they've had in getting assistance. Talk to the tenants themselves and try to help them figure out if they can pay anything on their rent if they're not getting assistance. So, and then just the formula that Senator Dhingra was talking about, I'd like to see more flexibility, whether we work with our federal partners on that, flexibility for our landlords, flexibility for our schools, but work to get some flexibility on some of these, because the rural districts I represent, rural school districts that I represent, have had a tougher time getting help with the federal funds. So flexibility and just looking at those reports as they come out.
Representative Maycumber. Just, making sure that that dollar for dollar is actually going to what is necessary, and then what is defined as the acceptable overhead. Is it 30%, 40%, and are those dollars reaching the people? I know some other states doing the rental assist program actually gave it to the landlord with an agreement with the tenants, and so you see that constantly staying in your apartment or house, and then you don't have that huge bow wave of a bill coming up, and that includes energy assistance too. You see that money going straight into it, so you don't have that huge bill that would come up after the implementation of the bills. So you really making sure that we did it right, that the money went to the individuals and to the people, and you don't see a bow wave. Unfortunately, I think sometimes fast and without barriers is what ESD did, and we saw a crisis there, removing some of those problems with making sure that we get the money to the right individuals and we do it properly. So, having those audits and not paying so much. We've seen some of the housing's costs per unit 10 times what you'll see in other areas. And I really have concerns as we look towards that we are accessing those money, making sure that they're going to the people, and they're going as it's needed, and they're getting access. And just like Senator Warnick said, some of these other areas are unable to access this with the strings that are provided.
Next question is from Graham Johnson from Cairo TV. Graham, go ahead.
Thanks so much and good morning. As Omicron surges, there's a real problem with people being able to access COVID tests. I'm wondering if the panelists would assess the adequacy of the governor's home testing effort announced yesterday, and also address whether you see additional opportunities at the state level to make more COVID tests available, or do you sense it might be too late in the Omicron surge to make a real difference?
Let's start with Representative Gregerson.
I think that's a great question. I think that's something that we're all still grappling with on whether or not the tests can get to the people fast enough. We're all hands on deck trying to get tests and masks to folks so that we can work towards wellness again.
Senator Warnick.
Thank you And, you know, the home test actually helped a relative of mine. He contracted Omicron. It was in a different state. He'd already had his vaccines, boosters, and had the actual Delta COVID. And then he contracted Omicron. But the home health test helped him figure out that little cold he thought he had was in fact Omicron. And so he was able to stay home and protect himself and his co-workers. So I think it's very important. I think we need to put all hands on deck out to get the supplies that we need to get those tests in the hands of everybody who is asking for them.
Representative Maycumber.
I think it's really important that we ebb and flow with this COVID crisis. And I've said it before, when we don't have communication across the state as a legislature, and it's being, the emergency powers is being ran by the governor with little to no communication for the rest of the state. I was just notified yesterday during the surge that there's some parts of my district that don't have a drive-in testing within 50 miles. And so people are making appointments and they're trying to get in, and they're talking days, if not weeks, for a test. This is the important part of hearing from all sides of the state and all corners of the state, that everybody should have equal access to making sure they have testing and availability to take care of this problem. And this happens when we have different parts of the state respond without communication. So we do need testing, and we do need it done, and we need to make sure that people have access to this. And this is just an example of making sure that we have equity across the state.
Senator Dhingra.
Thank you, Rachel. And again, I'll just say, access to testing, testing kits, drive-through, whatever it may be. This is not simply a state of Washington issue. It is a national issue. It's an international issue. And again, I think our governor has done a great job when it comes to dealing with COVID. And I am very grateful that we will have more testing options available. I have family all across the country. And when you talk to others in different parts of the country, they simply don't have the access to testing that we do, or for that regards on vaccines. So again, as Senator Warnick said, the more tests we can get, the better. However, there is a production issue. Companies aren't simply able to produce the number of testing kits that we need. And so, the more we can do in making sure everyone's vaccinated, everyone's boosted, everyone wears their masks, does social distancing, this is where individual responsibility has to really make sure come through. And again, stay safe for yourself, stay safe for your family members.
Earlier, one of you discussed the concerns about declining enrollment, and I did see a bill introduced that pertained to that this session, at least one so far. Can you talk a little bit about how best to deal with those declining enrollment numbers, and then also more broadly, the issues that students are facing because of the pandemic, and how to really help them move forward, both on mental health issues, education loss issues? And I'll start with Senator Dhingra on that.
Thank you, Rachel. So, the way we do our funding, tying it to enrollment is interesting. We have to really take a look at what those formulas are. I think Senator Warnick had mentioned that as well, in really re-looking at that. It is interesting, the experiment that occurred with virtual learning, online learning, asynchronous learning. And what was really interesting is it actually worked well for some kids. Obviously not all, but it did for some. And so really going forward is how are we making sure that all of these options are actually available to all of our students? And I think we have to get really creative on what we think education looks like and what it should entail. These kids are going to have jobs that will require Zoom or Teams or some newer version of a virtual workplace. And so our understanding of the education we have is going to be different than the education our children are having. I'll just say one other quick thing is, every year I actually have a couple of bills that have been brought to me by our students. And so this year there are two that I'm introducing. One of them is where a lot of these children feel that they should have the option of having at least one day of asynchronous learning. And so I'll be dropping that bill to, again, create that flexibility that not all education hours necessarily need to be in person in a chair talking to a teacher. And I think we have to look at how we educate our children in different ways. And the second one really gets to the behavioral health. You know, the youth have been telling us they need more help with mental health issues. And so again, these great high schoolers now from my district want to actually change graduation requirements from needing 1.5 of PE credit to 1 credit of PE and actually doing 1 credit of health, so they can really get more education around mental health, substance use disorder. And so I think it's imperative we listen to the children as well as the teachers and the administrators and the parents in taking a look at what education looks like in the future.
Representative Maycumber.
Thank you. You know, this one question goes into even the workforce question. I've had bills and amendments really looking at making sure our education system actually prepares our children, trains them, and gets them ready for the workforce. And if we had career training apprenticeships in every school, not just 200 miles away, like some of my schools can only get to a training center in the urban areas like Spokane, and that's just not feasible. There's not even housing available. And so making sure those 18 years actually, when they leave, they have some kind of sense of accomplishment. Now, we changed the education system to a per student ratio. And that is how we provide education in the state of Washington. And some schools have been very responsive, providing that assistance to homeschool families who are still actually enrolled in the school but can teach at home. And like the good senator just mentioned, online learning, an ALE program. And so you see those alternatives for those schools that are responsive. And those parents should have the opportunity to have their kids in school. And for those schools that are sensitive to those students and actually helping in those alternative ways, should be able to continue to provide that. Making sure that students have options and career training is very important. And as you know, as I know the governor is about to get on, that is one thing that I will commend him on, is keeping those schools open. We've really seen that stress of the students closing schools. So we want to make sure we keep them open and that we prepare them. We need to actually move our education into the 21st century and prepare them and get them ready and have opportunities, whether that's healthcare or a building trade or a college, that everyone has that opportunity, and that is up to the school districts to provide that.
Does anyone else want to weigh in before we move on to our final question?
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in.
Okay.
Senator Warnick, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I think this is a great opportunity to talk about Washington State. We actually responded to the digital divide. We're the #1 state according to National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and trying to close the digital divide. And with that, right, we're going to a one-to-one initiative for students and devices, but we're also investing in more digital literacy and ensuring that the school, everyone that is involved in learning and the school community has access to the online platform. And part of that is learning how to navigate that. If we have communities where it's lower speeds of internet, I think Representative Maycumber talked about that, or larger families that need more internet access to be affordable, those are the places where we can continue to move and create great change towards modernizing and allowing our school environment to thrive where they are, regardless of the pandemic. And I think we can continue to stay focused on that. The other is the mental health of our teachers and our staff, and ensuring that they have the resources they need. And while we know our students need that, our staff needs that too. And so really continuing to invest in that. And the last I'll say is the community-based treatment facilities. You're seeing lots of investments in trying to really make sure that there's localized access for folks to be able to get the care that they need. So I'm really hopeful that those are some of the things too that we're going to be investing in the short session.
Senator Warnick.
Yeah, thank you. And just to add to that, I heard from a superintendent just yesterday with the declining enrollment in her school, and it's not one of the smallest, but she stands to lose $2 million in funding. So we need to address this, whether we look at numbers in the past, find funding from normal years in the past. But again, I want to bring in the sports aspect of it. A lot of our students, especially in rural areas, sports are so important for their mental health. one young lady told me, I go to school so I can play basketball. And so we want to encourage, not only, I really want to thank the governor for keeping the schools open as well, but encourage the sports, the athletics in the schools. So thank you.
All right, and our final question for the panel comes from Austin Jenkins.
Is COVID adjacent, I think, but there was the mention, I think, by Senator Dhingra about providing funding for air exchange in schools. But on a broader basis, the state's now being sued by the Wahkiakum School District, a small district in Southwest Washington, that has schools that date to the 1950s. And along the lines of the McCleary case, they're saying that the state is not stepping up and doing an adequate job in terms of funding the capital needs of schools. With all of these billions of dollars in federal relief money, as well as fairly strong tax collections, I'm very curious to know whether this lawsuit and COVID and the plight of schools is spawning any conversation to take the next big bite of the apple in terms of McCleary 3.0 or 2.0 and fund infrastructure when it comes to K-12 education in the state on a much more robust and grand scale.
Representative Maycumber.
Awesome. Thank you for this question. I am definitely emotionally involved in this question. A lot of my rural areas, I've seen buckets in the roof, and even including where my children go to school. It's actually devastating. Some of the states of our classrooms, as you've seen, some of my areas, the cost of their property taxes went up, and so that basic education is a lot for the surrounding communities with low unemployment, inability to sometimes pay those property taxes, and then the increased burden on those bonds. Unfortunately, we're having difficulty, as you well know, and our children are going to school with little to no water, dripping mold. I mean, I could go on and on and on, it's just devastating. So it is something that we do have to look at. I completely agree. I don't know anything about the lawsuit. I won't comment on that, but really looking at how we are funding some of these schools. It's unfortunate. And just in the 7th district, we have schools that are beautiful, new, have heat and cooling. And my children go to school that don't actually have certain heating and cooling in the school. The school has no cooling. So sometimes it is very, very hot and unable to open windows. So the discrepancy in education airflow with more filters is not even available in our schools. And it's devastating to see the difference in education across the state, how some students are housed and how others are not. So I completely agree. That is an issue that I've been passionate about. And we do have to look at that, especially in those communities where property taxes has increased significantly. We do not have the tax base to afford it.
Senator Dhingra.
Thank you. This is something that, of course, as you mentioned, McCleary 2.0, 3.0, where does this end? And this is a challenge. It really is, because we have local areas that are willing to pass their levies and bond measures to invest in their local communities and schools, and there are other communities that those levies and bonds simply people refuse to pass. We also have the issue with the bond requiring way more than a simple majority, and that is a problem as well. So, there's systemic issues through all of this. What I will say from a state perspective, last year we did do quite a bit of investment in school infrastructure. OSPI was given grant monies. We did take a look at even taking a look at water quality in our schools and making sure we're providing dollars for that infrastructure to be upgraded. And I think this session is going to be no different. We do want to make sure we are making dollars available to our schools to improve their infrastructure. But, there's that challenge on, when communities are willing to take their money and invest in their own schools, and those communities that aren't, and how do you negotiate that? There is no easy answer, but it's a problem we will continue to work on. And this is where you need local partnerships, and you need local communities and local school districts, and you need everyone to pitch in and do their fair share.
Okay, and Representative Gregerson.
Thank you. This is definitely something we've been talking about for quite a while, whether it's a simple majority for passage of capital bonds. But we do recognize that local power elected officials representing those school districts, they have the oversight on how to care for their communities best, and the state tries to honor that. We'll certainly be monitoring and watching the lawsuit, and we're already talking with our capital budget to make sure that we're doing the best we can, whether it's with one-time dollars or to ensure that the schools that need a little bit of extra help are getting that, and more to come.
All right, well, that is time for this panel. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all of you joining us. We're going to take a quick 2-minute break so we can do a mic check with the governor's office, and we will be back on shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Testing. Testing.